Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's session. Let's go ahead and get started. We have a full agenda for you today. So my name is Melissa Christensen, and I'm an MBA student at INSEAD. I'm also a leader on the Endeavor team, which is INSEAD's Social Impact Student Club. And it's my pleasure to be moderating today's session. Today's session is part of a series of online and on-campus events at INSEAD for INSEAD's SDG Week, which is organized by the Hoffman Global Institute for Business and Society, in which we explore the most salient themes and opportunities to drive progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals. And this year's SDG Week is in sync with the global conversation around COP26 that we are watching closely. And it's a real pleasure to be thinking through some of these issues together with the INSEAD community. I'm joined by two sustainability experts today. We have Cyrus Suntuk from Accenture and Gwendolyn de Guiney from the World Economic Forum. And I'll ask them to briefly introduce themselves now. Can we start with Cyrus?
Yes, hi everyone. Lovely to be here. I'm Cyrus. I work in our sustainability leadership and organization practice at Accenture. Also a fellow at the World Economic Forum, working on our partnerships around leadership development. And looking forward to sharing a little bit more about what we've been working on with you today.
Thanks, and also Gwen, welcome.
Hi, Melissa. Thank you. So for the past 5 years, I've been working at the World Economic Forum on a team called the Young Global Leaders, an exceptional community of exceptional individuals driving impact in the world. And I'm particularly excited to be here today because when I was in my MBA, I was quite active in the Net Impact Club. So it's a pleasure to be here with you guys.
Great, great. Thank you both for joining. Thank you for making the time in this really busy week for the two of you. We are also joined by several members of the Hoffman Institute, and they're involved in lots of the back-end support and the coordination of these sessions. So really grateful to the whole team that helped bring this session to life. We would also like to know, and like you to know, who else is in the room today. So we have two short polls for that we'll activate right now so that we can get to know each other. So the first question is, where are you calling in from? So let's see. Great. So we have a majority European representation. That makes sense. But welcome also to our callers from the Middle East, from Asia, and the Americas. Someone woke up very early to join. Thank you. And next, we'd also like to know what your relationship is to INSEAD. So what's your connection here? Are you a current student? Are you an alum? I saw we have a number of alumni signed up for today, which is a real treat. So here's the breakdown. About a quarter of us are students, and a little more than that, alumni, and then also the broader community. So great, wonderful. Well, thank you for joining. Really excited about this conversation. We've made it in a group Zoom meeting format because we're really hoping that it can be quite interactive, participatory. We're going to have a hands-on workshop session. So we'll be breaking out into smaller groups to work together, and I'll just take a moment to talk you through our agenda here. I just want to see if we've got a slide for this. Great, perfect. Thanks, Anna. So here's what today's conversation will look like. We'll start off with a short conversation between Cyrus and Gwen, and Cyrus will be sharing some of the insights on research that was recently done with his team at Accenture on the key elements that make up a sustainable organization and how companies get started on that journey. And then we'll transition to a workshop time. We'll break out into smaller groups, and you'll work through a new diagnostic tool that's been developed to help you assess where your company is on its sustainability journey. And then we'll come back together and share some of those learnings and take questions from you. And our panelists will be available to engage with the questions that emerge through that. So without further ado, I give the floor to Cyrus to put a frame on today's conversation based on the research that he and his team have done about how responsible leaders create lasting value for all stakeholders. So Cyrus, over to you.
Thanks a lot, Melissa. I should have also mentioned I'm also an INSEAD alum, 19D, and was also part of the Endeavour leadership team as well at the time. So great to be back and still involved. So I'm really excited to share some of the research that we've done in collaboration with the forum as well, with the YGL team, Global Shapers, and the broader forum community. We launched this as part of the World Economic Forum's Sustainable Development Impact Summit, and also just shared this at COP just a couple of days ago. I've just come back from Glasgow, so it's been a bit of a whistle stop, but great to be there. Just realized I didn't share my audio as well. So before I kind of go into content, I wanted to just share a very quick video. Let me know if you can't hear, and just to set the scene a little bit.
Businesses are under ever greater pressure to deliver value for all stakeholders, to turn their responsible goals into actions and create lasting impact. Those that succeed begin by shaping into sustainable organizations. They bring a new awareness of how business gets done and how people are treated at work, what people are buying and who they're buying from, and how investors decide to allocate their capital. Shaping sustainable organizations implies transformation, rethinking how and why decisions are made, and cultivating new behaviors and capabilities to build a stakeholder-centric organization. The key is activating your sustainability DNA. It's what makes a truly sustainable organization: building human connections, collective intelligence, and shared accountability to benefit the organization, society, and the environment. To shape your sustainable organization, take our diagnostic to measure your sustainability DNA and start becoming the business your stakeholders want you to be, to deliver value and impact for all.
All right. Little cheesy, but hopefully gets the message across. And I think that the key thing really to start with here is that being a sustainable business is not just about environmental sustainability, but it really is that kind of broader view of what it means to run a business or an organization that works for all stakeholders. And I think it's no surprise to anyone here that this is no longer an option. This is a business imperative. Now more than ever, business leaders are under this significant pressure from a variety of stakeholders to really develop organizations that work for everyone, from employees, consumers, and increasingly more and more investors as well are looking to understand what does this actually mean for them and for their broader community. And interestingly, executives are keen on delivering this. So they are saying, a lot of executives saying that becoming a truly sustainable business is a top priority. Some fewer of them have been developing plans for adopting and scaling these. At least that's what they say, whether across their entire organization or for certain business units. But what's interesting is to look at the say-do gap, the action intention, and really start to explore what is the difference between what organizations and leaders are saying that they're doing or trying to put in place and what actually they need to have. But when we sort of start and when we actually think, what does this kind of responsible business, sustainability look like? We want to kind of go back to what are the core elements that we would expect to see. And in a paper that we did with the forum about a year ago, we started to look at what are the elements that we want to see from our leaders. And we discovered these sort of 5 elements of responsible leadership that really are the ones that drive both financial value, social value, and innovation and equitable value across all stakeholders. And what we really wanted to look at this year, though, is fine. If these are elements, great. There's lots of leadership frameworks out there, but what does this actually look like in practice? What does this mean from a leadership behaviors perspective at an individual level, as well as from an organizational perspective? What are the practices and systems that you'd want to put in place that really embed this within your DNA? And what we've been looking at is that DNA at an organizational level. So this idea of sustainability DNA that embeds things in 3 key ways. First one, through human connection. And what we mean by this is really where leaders have the opportunities to systemically understand the needs and desires of a broad range of stakeholders, really driving that human connection, collecting that insight, particularly from traditionally unheard or underobserved stakeholders. The second piece to that is using that insight to make better decisions. That kind of collective intelligence where you're using the insights that you've got to drive that decision making, and again, moving it away from being the remit of an individual leader or an individual sort of sustainability team or whatever that might look like, to really be thinking about what does it mean for everyone in the organization to be making these sorts of decisions. And that really then drives that third key piece, which is accountability at all levels. So it's no longer just the remit of the individual at the top, the hero on a horse, but actually is the remit of all all employees for all stakeholders. And I'm not going to go into all of this because obviously there's a lot, but this is what we've been looking at, what you will get an opportunity to try later on in the workshop part of this session, is the different elements that make up the sort of sustainability DNA. And we looked across 4,000 organizations to look at those different practices that make up these elements, and looked at indicators of responsible and sustainable businesses. And some of these were hygiene factors, such as having the right policies in place, having certain processes, and so forth. But some of them were a bit more complex. So things like making bold commitments that you shared publicly, whether it was around your journey to net zero, whether it was around your gender and ethnicity targets, or whatever else that might be. And then tying things to executive compensation so that your leaders are actually held accountable to that, or even signing up to third-party agreements like the UN Global Compact, Fair Trade Alliance, or similar things. So that complexity and range of how you can look at your maturity of the sustainability practices is what we were really exploring here. And what we found was that those organizations with a stronger sustainability DNA, where they had more of these indicators really in place, outperformed by both financial and sustainability metrics. So this is not just simply looking at the analogy that you might use is an athlete. Typically, you might look at their time, the time they take to run a race. But what we wanted to actually look at was, what about their training regimen? How good is their diet? How good is their lifestyle? And then you can see the outputs, the sort of height, weight, blood pressure, speed, etc. And what we really did see, which is good to see, is that those organizations that have a more robust sustainability DNA do result in that higher financial and sustainability value. But most companies do need to strengthen their sustainability DNA. The average score is, to be honest, pretty average, about 52 out of 100. But interestingly, organizations were slightly better at those practices that drove insight, that human connection, than they were at using that insight to make better decisions, turning those insights into action. So it's worth thinking about within your own organization, and you may well have seen it. How many times have you been part of an employee survey or an employee feedback sort of exercise, but then perhaps not seen action come off the back of that? And it's sort of, how do we really embed that insight into action in a systemic way? And there's sort of a cycle that we've been thinking about with the forum of how organizations can mature in the right way. And really, firstly, it starts with really understanding and diagnosing the strength of your own organization's sustainability DNA. You could look at that from an individual leader perspective or across the organization. use that to really define those interventions to address areas for development, and then develop your own roadmap to, as you kind of so-called create value while leading with values. And the key thing here is that this is not, it never will be a linear progression. This will always be a cyclical thing, because sustainability is ever evolving. Our understanding of things, the research is always changing. And so that continuous cycle of improvement is critical if we are to make the changes that we need within the organizations and in the society more broadly. I'll pause there, and Mel, I'll hand it back over to you.
Thanks, Iris, for that, and thanks for giving some context to this and sharing some of those learnings. I want to start out our short discussion here with digging a level deeper into some of what you shared here, and really ask you, out of these key ingredients that you have identified, are there some that really stand out as the most salient in really like driving those strategies forward to shape sustainable organizations? So yeah, what are the key ingredients, if you could distill it? I know it was a matrix of things, but were there some that were most salient to you, and
Sure.
How do you see that?
So I guess for me, the start is really to understand what it is that you need to do, and make those commitments. So, for example, within Accenture, and I know loads of other organizations have made net zero commitments that have been publicly stated. They've made gender equity commitments. They've made ethnicity commitments. So they've made all sorts of different commitments, and then have also done things like tied the compensation and the bonuses of our senior leadership to the achievement of those targets and of those goals. So that sort of, the kind of put your money where your mouth is to a certain extent. And I think that sort of combination of bold, ambitious public commitments with really tying it to what's essentially your performance management process, bake it into objectives, bake it into compensation, bake it into performance and reward. I think that's a key element to actually making these things happen and making them real.
Thanks. Yeah, I've seen that as well in organizations. So yeah, the commitments and then the tying it to actual performance is it's not an easy task, but I agree, it's what really helps catalyze those actions. Gwen, I would like to shift over to you and ask you a similar question. In all of your exposure there at the forum to different organizations that are experimenting and trying out different things, what are those best practices that you've seen? What are those key ingredients of successful strategies that shape sustainable organizations?
Yeah, so for me, what was so interesting from the work that we did with Accenture was to see where there were overlaps and sort of surprises from the experience that we've had. So the Young Global Leaders community has been around for 15 years, trying to accelerate impact of leaders individually and collectively in their organizations, but also as a collective, as a community. And the big learnings that we've observed over the years is that there is three ingredients that really help them accelerate their impact. One of them is building a community of trusted peers where they can be vulnerable, where they can share and be inspired by other people. So that's what we've observed over the years, and it was so interesting to then see, the research confirming the emotion and intuition and the inspiration piece. It was like this overlap that was from our experience confirmed then by data. Similarly, a second ingredient that we identified over time was the need to equip them and to invest in their leadership with training and skills. And again, interesting to see in the research that a lot of people want to make change but don't necessarily know how. It's hard, and so the more you can sort of give them tools and the knowledge. So Cyrus talked about intellect and insight. He also talked about people wanting to make the change but not necessarily implementing it. And I think people need help. And so we have in our program education modules and sort of training for leaders that to help them with that. And I would say maybe the third aspect, which, and for those who know the World Economic Forum, you might not be surprised that I mentioned this, is sort of the multi-stakeholder approach. I think a big thing to acknowledge is that, you know, businesses can't make change in a vacuum. They operate in an ecosystem where, you know, public sector has a role to play as well, civil society has a role to play. And of course, what we try to do, because it's our sort of our DNA at the forum, is to try to bring these sectors together and these multi-stakeholder approach to solving some of these issues. And so some of the success stories that we have are often, and where the magic happens definitely within the young global leaders community, is where you have someone maybe from the private sector acting together with someone from another sector, or being, you know, inspired by other players, and get those players to work together. So at a big level, this is kind of some of the key ingredients that we've learned, and it was very interesting to see it supported by the data, even though it's, you know, maybe a different angle or different words, but there was definitely some overlap there. So that was interesting.
Yeah, super interesting. Having trusted peers that you can share with, having the tools to develop your own leadership, and connecting with your ecosystem. Yeah, that really resonates as those ingredients. I wanna flip over then to the other side of the coin. So those are the ingredients that accelerate this. What do you see as the barriers, as the blockers, as how have you seen organizations that are stuck, and why are they stuck? What have been the most common root causes that you've seen? Gwen, I'll ask that, and then I'll
okay
with the same question.
Well, you know, I think, and Cyrus touched upon it briefly in his presentation, I think the incentive system, it's very hard to ask people to behave differently if you know, it's not rewarded and it's not incentivized. I think change is hard. There's fear of change, but there's also, like, you know, competing priorities. So I think on an individual level, if your incentives are not there, it's really hard to you're trying to do your best on what's actually measured. It's hard to then on your own free time add. So there needs to be the right incentives, and I think that's true at an organizational level as well. And that's where the multi-stakeholder, when I said, you know, change doesn't happen in a vacuum, I think, you know, regulation changing, pressure from like consumers and investors that we're seeing now is great, because it's changing the ecosystem. When those were not there, it was hard to ask people to make change just, you know, out of the goodness of their heart, when they have so many conflicting pressures. I think anything we can do to change the incentives, but also the short-term approaches of just, you know, traditional capitalism, which is again slowly changing now, I think was a barrier, and it still is in many cases. And I think lack of support. The right reason why I mentioned first a community of trust is that there's a lot of pressure for leaders and for organization. You know, in the media, it's and everywhere, it's like so scrutinized. If you try and you fail, there's a huge risk. And so I think creating spaces where people can learn and try out, or maybe try small and then expand in a way that might not be, you know, immediately sort of sanctioned, and trying to create some protection in the incentives, and the ways things are measured until they have time to try this out, or in, you know, communities that are specifically created for this, like ours, where they can test ideas with colleagues confidentially or in a prototype level. I think, you know, would remove some of these obstacles, because, you know, and then there's last but not least, behavioral change, you know, is hard. And again, that's an obstacle for all of us. I mean, look at any of us when we try to take good resolutions in our life, sometimes we don't apply them. Why is that? The human beings are, you know, have their own personal barriers. And I know Accenture has been working with us on helping people through some of these behavioral changes. And I don't want to steal Cyrus's thunder, but I think those are some of the difficult barriers to make change happen.
Shall I jump in there just to build on what Gwen said? So, I mean, yeah, all the stuff around incentives, behavior change, etc. I think I won't repeat that. I think just to build on it with a couple of other points. I think one is around and I touched on it earlier, that distinction between individual accountability and shared accountability. When we're looking at sustainability within organizations, within whatever, at the moment, still there sometimes seems to be the sustainability team or the sustainability lead or whatever that may be. And that kind of almost becomes the remit of that team. They're the ones that need to be sustainable. They're the ones that deal with whatever it is, and we just do our own thing. And it harks back to something you may have already seen this, but to the attitudes that were around things like digital or innovation. And our CEO Julie Sweet actually said at Davos last year, sustainability is the new digital. We shouldn't be thinking about it in a team. We should be thinking about how do we really embed it across everything within the organization. And I know that we've actually, a while ago, we got rid of our digital practice, because basically now everything that we're doing, whether it's strategy, consulting, technology or whatever, there's digital within all of it. And that's not just us, right? Like, every organization is moving in that way as well. And sustainability is heading in that direction, absolutely needs to do so. And then the second thing I'll just mention is, I think there's a perception gap between different stakeholders, between the market and the organization, between leaders and their people, between the organizations and their customers, about what are we doing and what are we investing in, what kind of impact does that make. Example that I've just seen myself is, you may well have those examples where an organization says, oh yeah, we invest in our employee growth. We just invested X million dollars in an employee reskilling program to make sure they've got future ready skills, ready for the blah blah blah. And then you talk to the individual employees and they say, oh yeah, but my manager never lets me go and do training because they always say it's a waste of time when I'm not at my desk. So that perception gap, and you may well have experienced similar stuff within your own organizations, that perception gap is there. And organizations and leaders really need to figure out how do they bridge that gap, because it's not just about where you are, it's also about how aligned are you across your different stakeholders to be able to move forwards together. And I think that's a key challenge for leaders and organizations to move forwards.
Yeah, very, very interesting. Yeah, I can picture that in my own experiences for sure. Before we transition to the workshop here, one last question for Cyrus. What advice do you have for organizations that are just starting out on this journey? How do they even start figuring out where they need to get started?
Yeah, it's a very good question. And I mean, we're seeing this a lot from CEOs and leaders where they say, okay, I get this there's a sustainability thing, I need to figure it out. But, and I kind of know what it is, I think, but I've no idea where to start. And, really the first thing is just to acknowledge, that there is something to do. And then I would just start by just embarking on a bit of a listening exercise. Right, listen to your stakeholders, listen to the people that are involved, and don't just listen to your standard stakeholders. One organization that we worked with set up a kind of a forum of dissenters, in a way, people who are actually, who are activists against what they were doing, who had complained, etc., and actually listened to what they were saying in quite an active way. Listen to their employees, listen to their customers. You can't spend all your time listening, because that's also, can be an excuse for inaction. But if you want to start by listening, and then use that to really define what are those priorities, and then move as quickly as you can into action. Organizations, they know how to do things. We know how to do things, but it's understanding where to start, and where to start, just listen. And various tools that you can use to do so as well.
That's really simple and powerful. So let us transition now into our hands-on part of this, our workshop time. So this is how it's going to go. We'll break we'll divide you up into different breakout rooms of about 4 or 5 people. And Cyrus, can you share with us what should go on in those breakout rooms?
Absolutely. So I'll ping this all in the chat as well. So firstly, just, we wanted to give you guys the opportunities to meet each other, get to know each other a little bit, say hi. And then I'm also pinging in the chat a short diagnostic tool that we developed in collaboration with the forum. Should take about 2 minutes and will help you to understand the maturity of your own kind of sustainability DNA. Quick indicator. And it will give you a score across the different 5 elements. And then really think within your discussion, what are you doing that is amplifying your strongest element? And what could you do to strengthen your weakest element? Share your ideas across the group and consider what practices could you put in place, either individually or organizationally, to continue on your journey to a more sustainable organization. And I'm pinging all of that in the chat right now. So.
And Cyrus, just a quick question. I'm thinking for our students that are here that aren't currently in a professional organization, aside from INSEAD, how should they approach this?
So if you really good question. So just either pick your previous organization, pick an organization that maybe you're aspiring to join, but know something about. You'll see the questions, but I would definitely advise you to pick an organization that that you have some sort of personal experience of. I think we may have a couple of uni students here as well, so maybe just you could pick your university, pick a parents organization, but just something that you feel like you've got a reasonable understanding of that, or maybe some other organization. But yeah, I think that's where I would go.
Great. All right, so we'll head into that right now, and just want to encourage everyone that's on the call here, if questions emerge as you are discussing that you want to ping to us, you can send those in the chat to the hosts, and also that'll help inform our Q&A discussion that we'll have afterwards. So you're going into breakout rooms now for 15 minutes, and we'll bring you back into the main room, and want to get your questions that you have for Cyrus, questions for Gwen, questions that you have for each other. Really want that to be in a really conversational mode right now. So feel free and don't be shy to send those questions. And we'll head out into the breakout rooms now and see you in 15 minutes. Would be keen to hear what questions came up during your breakout time, what reflections you had specifically around like an element of what a sustainable organization is that you learned from your group time. So feel free to share that kind of a comment, and also any questions you have for the audience. So you can just go ahead, and I think we have the hand raising function that should be working. So feel free to raise your hand, and we'll start with Catherine. Feel free to unmute and keep your video on if you'd like.
I don't think I can get it on actually.
Okay. Oh, okay. Okay.
Sorry, I got a bit carried away on my reactions there.
Enthusiastic. Let's hear it.
Yeah, exactly. I'm sort of sure I can see Shauna's on here. We were in a group of 3 of us, and the most valuable comment that was made was the importance of education and educating internally. And that when actually people get the facts and understand the facts and know the detail, and these terms have meaning, that the sort of the acceleration of your journey begins, if you like.
Mm-hmm.
Shauna, I don't know if there's anything else you wanted to add, because you're really doing this, and so it was great hearing from her.
Yeah, I definitely feel that it starts with education, then and rallying around a common purpose. So the purpose, and then ultimately, if you can align that purpose, the purpose journey of sustainability with respects to all stakeholders up to your corporate purpose. So that's the sweet spot, is finding what that looks like relative to your industry or relative to your company's goals and aspirations. That is a good start, because then people feel like they're working on something meaningful. Their work then becomes incredibly meaningful, which draws in significant engagement, which ultimately is a business. That's what we all strive for, is to have our people engaged, because then they become strong leaders. So, but if they don't understand how it reflects to their day-to-day and why this is important to the business, then it will always be one of those things that's siloed outside as a nice to have, and not necessarily a need to have. And then
Agreed.
as priorities come up, it's easy for it to just say, oh, well, this is a, we'll talk about this another time, but anecdotally, but yeah, I would say that education and purpose are the two big ones.
Yeah, I agree. I don't know if either of our panelists want to respond to that. And
maybe just very quickly build on it. I completely agree. And I mean, when you talk about sustainable organizations, people think, oh, is this an HR issue or is this a sustainability issue? And you're absolutely right. It's both and neither. It's a business strategy issue, and you should be embedding becoming a more sustainable business into your business strategy, into your business priorities at a CEO, exec, board level, in order to then you're absolutely right, that education piece shows that you are not just doing kind of a side thing, but it's actually a core part of your business's core strategy.
Yeah. Who else has questions for our panelists, or reflections, learnings from the diagnostic conversation? I've got one in my pocket, if not. One of the questions that comes up often here at INSEAD is what sort of generational pushes can happen. So if my MBA cohort is in a certain generation and we want to kind of activate more of the executive level, more of the earlier generation on these issues, what are examples of effective ways to push? And wanted to hear, Gwen, what you've seen in your work on that. What are some success stories, and what are the best practices with that?
Well, thank you. I don't know how much you know about the history of the Young Global Leaders community at the World Economic Forum, but it was actually, created to have younger representation in Davos and in the global sort of conversation. And one of the reasons is because, we thought building coalitions earlier made it more likely for projects to be successful, but also you noticed immediately with that generation coming in a different tone and different sort of priorities. And I think we've all noticed that specifically on sustainability and the environment, there's a generational gap. So definitely, where it was a nice to have, I think the generation of the young global leaders, which is under 40, understand that it's a key component of a sustainability strategy. And then the next generation, which is another community that we also have at the World Economic Forum called the Global Shapers, who are typically under 30. For them, it's sort of priority number one in most sort of questions that we ask that is top of mind for them, and the worries that they have and the anxiety that they have. So it's not even like a sustainability priority, it's just a livelihood priority. And so what we've seen very impressive is sort of the power of that generational shift in making change. And so before, in our previous exchange a couple of minutes ago, we were talking about like how sometimes, the leader can't just bring change alone, but I think sometimes it does come from like grassroots and from the employees and from the younger generation pushing. And if I can take an example from the Global Shapers community, they are organized there. So they're young people organized throughout the world in hubs of cities. And sometimes those hubs that come together on topics that they really care about. And one example is called Shaping Fashion, where multiple hubs sort of got together to push to put pressure on the industry in terms of sustainability practices, because we know that the sort of fashion industry has huge impact. And I think there could be so many other examples, and I'm sure that within organizations, there must be similar movements happening where the younger, which is sometimes the bigger part of the employees are younger, putting pressure sometimes to senior management because they have such a different vision of what that means for them.
Yeah, Cyrus, I'm curious if you see that, like, within organizations, what that push looks like, can look like, should look like. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's any should, right? I think different organizations are going to do it in completely different ways. I mean, I'm sure people have seen the story of the Google, the kind of internally organized Google open letter to the Google CEO around the use of Google's technology for the Pentagon, for the so-called business of war. And it was a result of that employee pressure that they stopped doing it. That's when Norwich made that decision. So I do think there are opportunities, but part of that was that public. It was a public letter. That public pressure really kind of, well, arguably is a part of what forced that change. And I also think just Gwen made a really good point around listening to younger generations, but also more broadly listening to underrepresented stakeholders. That maybe younger generation. Sometimes it's women, sometimes it's people from the global south, people who are not typically represented in senior leadership positions. And I was at a Global Shaper event yesterday in Glasgow, and one of the shapers was saying, she's an amazing young woman from Brazil, and Black young woman from Brazil, and she was like, this is completely fair to say, it's a white global north discussion often, that is where the policies, the decisions, the funding is there, but the issues, the disruptions and the problems tend to happen in the global south, disproportionately affecting women, people of color, those who are in sort of the more vulnerable populations. So listening, or younger people as well. So proactively bringing those voices into the conversations, I do think is a key part of creating that pressure.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's a really good. It's a lot harder to go farther out to listen to. You have to seek out those voices. They don't just happen. I got a message from Stefan about wanting to raise a question. Do you want to unmute and do that directly?
Sure. I think, Melissa, you referred correctly to different batches at INSEAD. I'm an MBA 85. I went to INSEAD 33, so I'm definitely one of the very older cohorts, still alive. Now, my question, probably related with a comment, would be the following. And in our small group, with Sean, we were talking about it. Sometimes it seems, what the heck is so new about what we are discussing? Because 30 years ago, we talked about the social responsibility of corporations. We talked about the 3E when we look at companies and look at their performance. So why now we are in that beautiful tsunami of having so much interest and advancing the metrics, the toolkits and everything? What do you believe is the reason? Is it that formerly powerless people are connected in forums and social media, that they can drive a cause? Is it that finally the middle batch of more sensitive managers reach the top? And as a last comment, when you are about 70, you couldn't believe in the 70s when we were looking at the Vietnam, at the film with the hair, and the people were saying, this the age of, or the decade of Aquarius is coming. At that time, everything was dualistic. We couldn't believe that apparently there's a zeitgeist that makes us to join and align behind an important cause. So what element, that would be the two questions. What element empowers the younger people? I guess among others, social media. The other one, what kind of zeitgeist are we confronted that we were not confronted 20, 30 years ago?
Thanks for that question. I have a couple thoughts, but I want to open it to our panelists if you had some reflections.
Well, thank you so much for sharing this. I don't have, of course, the answer, but like some things that come to mind, I think definitely is around, I think, new means of communication for two aspects. One is I do think that the power to sort of, like you said, connect voices that were maybe before isolated in their communities can now come together and create campaigns or movements through social media and sort of decentralize the information systems. I think also the sort of ubiquity of communication maybe has made more visible the climate sort of impact and environmental disasters. Maybe 30 years ago, 50 years ago, you were not aware of a flood happening in, another continent. Whereas now I think we're all, we cannot ignore the truth because the systems of information are there, the data is there. I think we have more ways of measuring, even I think satellite imagery, like it's just so obvious now. Whereas, so I think in general, media and communication has to have been one aspect, but I don't know, Cyrus, if you have any other reflections. This is a lot to unpack.
I completely agree around the visibility of things that are happening, the other side of the world is definitely there. But I also think for younger people, it feels far more like a real sort of existential crisis as well. One of the things that happened for the conversations that I was hearing at COP was just, you had these older leaders who were saying, yeah, I am getting pressure, I get that, but the biggest pressure I'm getting is actually across my dining table at home from my kids, from my 9-year-olds, 10-year-olds, teenagers who are saying, Mum, Dad, like, you are in this position who can make a difference. Why are you not doing it? Because, 50 years time, when I'm older, this is, we can see the changes that have happened, to Gwen's point, in the last sort of 10 years or something. Doesn't mean they weren't happening already, but now that visibility is there for those people who are in positions of power, and they're getting that pressure at home, I think, far more than they were before. So, yeah, I think to Gwen's point, no single answer, but Mel, if you've got something to add as well.
I do, but I'm gonna refrain because we're out of time. So to conclude our time here, we wanted to invite everyone to consider what next step you will make for in your journey in driving transformation through your organizations and through your own lives. Cyrus talked about the importance of public commitments in that, and so that's what we'd like to invite you to do, is to consider what's something that you want to activate in the coming week. Like, really think immediately, what next step can you take, and how can you make that commitment public, which helps it helps us change. We all, humans, tend to be resistant to change. So think about what commitment you want to make and how you can make that publicly. This will be my last question to our panelists, and I'll also start by sharing my new public commitment. I'm currently in the recruitment process with several companies, and so my commitment is that in each interview I'll ask my potential employers about their organization's sustainability commitments and their ambitions and their process. that's one way that I know that I can sort of push. And so that's my new commitment. Cyrus, how about you?
Fantastic, thanks, Bill. And I will say, as someone who is interviewing MBA students, I am getting that question from them. So can you tell me a bit more about your own sustainability, your Accenture sustainability commitments to diversity, etc.? So it's definitely, it's a great one. I think I'll make sort of two ones. So one is I'm trying to do this already, but finding individuals who are at more junior levels, who are from less sort of representative backgrounds and leadership, and just trying to proactively mentor, find opportunities for them, even just one or two people to try to support them to grow and develop within my organization. And then second thing is to really try to carve out time to have conversations with everyone in my team that's nothing to do with work. So I'm quite sort of trying to make that quite tangible.
Nice. Well, thanks, Melissa, for putting us on the spot. I think it's important. We should all do this to each other. It's helpful. We were talking about peer support. I think sometimes peer pressure also is helpful. I mentioned the fashion industry, and I think if you do look into the numbers, it's quite scary how our societies consume clothes and don't keep them very long. And so one of the things that I'm sort of taking steps towards and committing to is to try to buy less new clothes and buy as much secondhand clothes as possible. And I don't know if those of you on the line who have kids, it's even scarier because they don't, it's just such a fast pace of change when they grow. That already, I think, buying your kids' clothes is secondhand, and now there's an increasing number of apps for like swapping and buying secondhand or exchanging. So you don't need, to even go to a specific shop necessarily, but I think committing to buying less, and therefore this, throwing out less clothes can go a long way. So that will be mine.
Thank you. Well, thank you everyone for joining this rich exchange, and thanks for your questions that came up. And there's two next steps that you're invited to. One is to visit Accenture's webpage and report, which is full of those insights and resources for you. So I'll share a link to that in the chat. And I also invite you to check out other sessions of the SDG week. So we're in our last day of the 3 days, and there's some additional sessions happening later today. So feel free to sign up for those on the website, and there are really some rich conversations happening, so worth the time. And finally, I think we'll have a survey right at the end of this, so feel free to take that survey and share your feedback about this session. Really keen to hear that. And that is all on my radar. I'll just conclude with thanking again each of you for joining, for being so active. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you, Cyrus. Thank you, Gwen, for making the time to prepare and share today. I know it's a really full time for the both of you, so really, really grateful that you made the time. And I'm also grateful to the Hoffman Institute, to Ketel and her team that have put a lot of effort into organizing these conversations this week. So thank you very much. And
thank you, Mel, for having us.
My pleasure. Really enjoyed it. So thanks, everybody. Have a good rest of your day.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you all for joining.